This is part 9, where I refit the exhaust manifold, the i-VTECH solenoid valve, the cylinder head cover and the inner intake manifold. Replace the exhaust manifold, and note that new manifold fasteners must be used along with a new manifold gasket. Use a 14mm socket and torque to 44 Newton meters. So onto the exhaust manifold. Here's the new gasket. That is the correct position, so just drop it down there now. You are to use new bolts and fastenings according to Honda. So I'm just going to pop some of these bolts back in, or the studs. Check the location, that everything looks right and that the gasket's not misaligned. Happy with that. I'm putting a little bit of light oil on. So there's 5 fixtures here. This should be the last one now. It is quite awkward. So 44 Newton meters to torque those. So start tightening at the centre of the manifolds between cylinders 2 and 3 and work your way out towards cylinders 1 and 4. That way it's evenly tightened. Now the manifold shield. Use a 12mm socket and torque to 22 Newton meters. So here's the shield, and you can see the 3 holes where the bolts go through. So we just pop that back on. I'm going to put some copper grease onto the threads so that if I need to remove it later on, it's easier to do so. That's my second bolt. And then these are tightened to 22 Newton meters. It is quite awkward to stretch over there down the back of the engine. There we are, 22 Newton meters. Reconnect the coolant pipe at the back of the cylinder head to the heater matrix. So we have got this pipe here that goes to the heater matrix inside the car, and we mustn't forget to pop that back on. So just push him in and then use some plumber's pliers or the like just to bring that spring clip back over and lock it in position, like so. Replace the i-VTECH solenoid valve assembly. Note that the rubber seal, the filter gauze, should be replaced at this point. 3 times 10mm bolts torqued to 12 Newton meters. Okay, we need to remove this old seal because that would be compressed now, and that also comes out with a piece of filter gauze, as you can see at the bottom. So I had a new seal that was in my head gasket set, so presumably you should get one in whatever set you're using. I'm just going to put a bit of oil on there to make sure that it slides into the fitting quite nicely. So then I can take my assembly now, make sure it's all clean there, and just gently push that in so that it's seated properly. And you can see the 3 holes where the long bolts are going to go through in a moment. So we need to just reach over to the back of the engine again and pop that in. So that's 3 long bolts, 10mm socket, and we do these up to either 10 or 12 Newton meters depending on the type of bolts you've got. So I'm going to set mine to 10, but yours could be 10 or 12 Newton meters. Now replace the VTC Oil Control Solenoid Valve. You may need to replace the O-ring. This is one 10mm bolt torqued to 12 Newton meters. So I think you're supposed to replace the O-ring on this and also check the filters are all clean. I didn't seem to have an O-ring in my set, so I've still had to use the original one, which I'd rather have not done. But anyway, so it's quite awkward, but we need to just pop that back in. And it's only one 10mm bolt, like so. And that is tightened to 12 Newton meters. Remove and replace the 4 spark plug oil seals in the cylinder head cover and also the main seal on the cover. Okay, there was 4 new seals in my head gasket set, so I thought best put them in. So to get the old ones out, I used a flat bladed screwdriver and hit at a sort of angle away from the cylinder head cover because I didn't want to damage the aluminium because it's very soft. So this technique seemed to work. Certainly it didn't give any damage, which is good. And then gradually pry them out. And then the last one. They are a very tight fit. Okay, so that's the 4 of them out. And then you've got the main seal that goes around the cover, which that's easy enough just to pull out. Like so. So we then need to put the new seals back in. Make sure you put them in the right way round, because they have to slide over those tubes. So make a note of them, which way they were. So I put a little bit of oil in there as well. Lined it up. You can't push them in with your hand, so I used a socket that was just smaller than the hole. But you want to be hitting onto the frame of these seals, otherwise you'll damage the lips on them. So make sure you've got a socket that's big enough. And I just gradually tapped all the way around until they were home. And I just put a little bit of oil in there. So those seals are pointing downwards so that the tubes go inside. So then I put a little bit of oil onto the main seal that goes on the cover. And that was easy enough to push into the groove all the way around the edge. Like so. Okay, so that's now ready to fit back onto the cylinder head itself. Replace the cylinder head cover, noting that you need to apply a couple of dabs of sealant to where the timing chain case meets the cylinder head. So we do need to apply a little bit of liquid gasket sealant to a couple of spots before we put the cover back on. So I'm using the 3-bond 1184 again. I'm just going to put a little dab here at the front where the timing chain is, and in the same place at the rear of the engine. Just a small dab, and leave that to dry for a bit. So I'm just going to wipe the gasket where the sealant would be. So because I did pre-oil this, so I'm just going to wipe that little bit of oil off there. So now we should be able to fit the cover back on. It's a bit awkward because you've got that power steering pump pipe in the way. There we are. And then we can carefully drop that down, push it down over those spark plug tubes, There's the seals. There we are. So we can now just put the new bolts and seals on the cover. The cylinder head cover is held on with 6 10mm cap nuts and must be tightened to 12 Newton meters and in the following sequence. Here's a photo showing that sequence. So the head gaskets that I ordered, these are all supplied with it. So I've got new rubber seals here with the caps that go on top. So I'm going to oil all of those just so they go in nicely. Hopefully create a nice seal. And then I can put all the cap nuts back on. And then we tighten these to 12 Newton meters. So you have to do it in a certain sequence. So there's all the cap nuts on. So 12 Newton meters. And we start here. Number 1. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. And lastly, the one at the back on the right hand side. Number 6. Then the 4 coil packs. Use a long reach 10mm socket and tighten to 12 Newton meters. So I've got my 4 coil packs here. I'm just going to pop these back in. So that's cylinder number 4. Note this one is actually a bolt for number 3. Number 2 is a standoff, and it's a bolt again for number 1. So cylinders 2 and 4 have like a standoff to help hold the plastic cover on. So these are the standoffs, as you can see. There's a thread at the top as well. So before I forget, I'll also pop the dipstick back in. Again, a little bit of oil on the 2 O-rings there, just to help it seat in properly. Like so. So I'm going to pull the wiring loom over now. Though as I found out later, there is the fuel pipe that's still got to pass underneath that. So although I connected the cam sensors, you may want to just hold fire on that for the moment. Or you may need to just disconnect them again when you come to put the fuel line back in, because that also bolts onto the side of the cylinder head. So there's like metal clips there. Now what I didn't do there was push it in at the top. So I need to unclip that again now at the bottom. Yeah, and it slides in at the top, that wiring loom. Like a little hook there. And it slides up, and then you push it over onto the clip like so. Like I said, I connected those, but you may want to just hold fire on connecting them quite so quick. So anyway, so I'm now going to put the wiring loom over the top of the cylinder head cover, and I'm going to pop the connectors on. And last one. Okay, so that now sits down there quite nicely, and we can tighten those screws. I'll speed this up like so, and then it's 12 Newton meters for the coil pack retaining bolts. So 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now the plastic coil pack cover, and that is 4 10mm nuts tightened to 9.8 Newton meters. So now we can put the plastic cover on. This is held on with 4 fastenings. Whoops, you missed that. Okay, got to find that later. So I'm going to also put a little bit of oil on these. Pop that one in. And the same for that one. So they're like a long reach, those rear ones. So it's 9.8 Newton meters. It's basically 10 Newton meters. Okay. So I think we've finished at this part now. Now to reinstall the coolant outlet manifold onto the front of the cylinder head with a new seal. Use a 10mm socket and tighten to 12 Newton meters. Note that if you remove the intake air bypass control thermal valve, as I had, you need to fit this back on first. So here's the coolant outlet, and we do need to replace the seal on this. So using a little pick, just remove that old seal. And there was a new one in the head gasket set that I bought. So I'm just going to give that a little bit of a clean with a soft wire brush. As there did seem to be a few little bits of like calcium deposits. I'm then going to put a little bit of light oil on the new seal. So we can now carefully pop that back in to the little groove. And this is held on with 2 bolts, and you need a 10mm socket for this. Make sure the surfaces are clean also on the cylinder head. Now just before you put this on, before fitting this, put the intake air bypass control thermal valve back on if you have removed it. So I had forgotten to put that back on, and obviously I had to take this back off again, because you can't thread the bypass control valve on while it's actually in place. So I tightened these 2 bolts to 10 Newton meters, though Honda do say 12 Newton meters. But since I was going to take it back off again, and don't forget to put this coolant pipe back on, and put the metal clip back on. There we are. Now the inner intake manifold. This is held on with 5 bolts and 2 nuts and will require a new gasket. So use a 12mm socket and tighten these to 22 Newton meters. So we will need to use a new gasket on this. And bear in mind they are quite sharp, so go careful. You don't want to cut your finger like I did on that. Now the inner manifold is quite tricky to fit back in, but if you're careful it will fit in. So here's the new gasket. So we can just slide that onto the 2 studs, like so, and the manifold will need a little bit of work in it, but it will go back on if you persevere. So it's now on. So there is 2 nuts at the top, which are quite tricky to get on. So anyway, so I'm going to put the bolts in first. Now I found it easier to remove these 2 brackets using a 10mm socket to get those two nuts on at the top. So you've got a bit more access then. So once you've got all those in, it's 22 Newton meters to tighten. You tighten from the centre outwards. Although that torque wrench did say 23, that was a mistake. I'd meant to do 22. It is hard to tighten those two nuts in the middle, so I actually used a spanner in the end and just torqued the others. Now at the end of this, you'll see the mistake I made with that valve. So by putting the little coolant manifold on earlier, I can't now spin this on. So I had to remove that part again so I could put it back on. So I've now put it back on, as I should have done earlier. So I can now just pop this pipe on and make sure we do the little metal clip up, like so. Now bring the fuel pipe back over. Use a 10mm socket for the two bolts and tighten them to about 10 Newton meters. So I'll just remove these two bolts there, which I'd put in for safekeeping. So it does need to go behind the wiring loom, which can be a bit tricky. Okay, so those two bolts are now out. So the cam sensor connectors may need to be disconnected. I mean, I was able to just squeeze it behind there, like so. But yeah, we do need to disconnect the cam sensors again. But it will fit behind there. So there we are. So we can now pop our two bolts back in. So I'll speed this part up. I tightened these to about 10 Newton meters. I wasn't actually sure on the torque settings, but I would assume about 10 would be about right. And just remember to connect your cam sensors back on, and also your water sensor, which is underneath that loom. Make sure that's connected. The connector was just underneath this wiring loom. Now the plastic outer intake manifold. The rubber seal should be replaced. Use a 12mm socket for the 5 bolts and tighten them to 22 Newton meters. So these seals came with the head gasket set. So they're easy enough to pull out. They come in a pair. So that was cylinder 3 and 4. And then cylinder 1 and 2. And these are easy enough just to gently push back into position. The seal here is quite important, otherwise you'd end up with an intake leak, which could cause some running problems. So it's worth putting the new seals on. Okay, so they're on, so we can now fit the outer intake manifold to the inner manifold. Here are some detailed photographs with the labels to help with identifying all the visible parts. I put them on for only 4 seconds each with the idea that you can pause them for detailed viewing. Thank you for watching, and please see the final part 10 in this series.